Hi, I am Uriel.
And I'm Zoe. Welcome to the serial podcast story called The Founder, a cyberpunk parable.
We are broadcasting this podcast from Earth Prime.
Yeah, I know that may sound a bit weird, but if you stick around to the end, we promise we will explain that to you.
Right. But for now, I really want you to think of this deep dive as being, well, like an audiobook.
Exactly, because at this point, there is only this audio format. There is no physical book yet.
Yeah.
So as we delve into these sources, just, remind yourself that you are the third person sitting right here with us in this immersive journey.
And it is quite the journey. I mean, imagine handing the psychological keys to the well-being of, 5 billion people to a traumatized, isolated 19-year-old.
It's wild.
Imagine a world where the algorithms on your phone aren't just trying to sell you shoes, but are actually, mathematically engineered to strip mine your soul for quarterly profit.
Yeah, that is the reality of the source material we are exploring today.
It's a staggering premise.
It really is. But before we look at the granular details of the opening moments, we need to zoom out. We need to provide a sweeping, completely spoiler-free overview of this entire universe.
Like reading the back of the book cover.
Right, exactly. So at its core, this is a high-stakes cyber thriller. But it's wrapped in these profound, systemic, philosophical undertones that fundamentally redefine what we think of as true cyberpunk.
I want to stop you right there, actually, because, cyberpunk carries a lot of baggage.
Oh, for sure.
Usually when people hear that term, they picture a very specific aesthetic. Neon rain, trench coats, high-tech, low-life.
Yeah, the classic tropes.
Right. But structurally, it almost always sinks into this inescapable nihilism, like the idea that corporations have won. Humanity is just meat in a machine, and literally nothing you do actually matters.
Which is such a depressing dystopia.
It is.
The neon is blindingly bright, but the human spirit is just completely extinguished. But what is so fascinating here is how this universe subverts that entirely. Well, in this source material, true cyberpunk means that while the dark is terrifyingly dark, and we are going to see immense systemic trauma and addiction loops and algorithmic violence, it is met with radical vulnerability and infinite hope.
Wow.
The contrast is what matters, The light is blindingly bright precisely because of the absolute darkness it has to pierce.
And the central metaphor driving all of this is what really hooked me. The overarching architecture of this universe is that reality itself exists as a massive virtual server.
Created by the founder.
Right, the founder, which is the story's representation of God. And this server is running two parallel engines simultaneously.
Okay, break that down for us.
So there's a physics engine that governs matter, gravity, thermodynamics, all that stuff. But layered directly on top of that is a moral engine governing the human soul.
I love that. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the connective tissue between the founder and the creation is what the text calls the logos, or the living word.
The root code.
Exactly. Think of the logos as the uncorrupted, flawless root code of the universe. It's the operating system as it was originally designed.
Right.
Meanwhile, there is the living signal. This represents the Holy Spirit. It acts as a direct network connection, like a real-time uplink, linking human consciousness back to the founder.
But as with any massive network, it is under constant, devastating attack.
Yeah, big time.
We are talking about a massive war of influence happening across the entire architecture of human civilization. The primary adversary is running what's called the Beast Protocol, driven by a demonic entity named Malphas.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, because this isn't a guy with horns and a pitchfork. The Beast Protocol doesn't use hellfire. It uses systemic entropy, infinite scrolling, algorithmic addiction.
And the aggressive monetization of human outrage.
Yes. All to push civilization into a closed-loop death spiral.
Because the enemy realized that you don't need to physically torture humanity if you can just distract them into spiritual starvation.
That is such a heavy line.
Yeah.
Spiritual starvation.
Right. And countering that malicious code is the Logos Protocol, which operates on principles that seem entirely counterintuitive to a tech-driven world. Things like grace, healing, and sacrificial interaction.
And caught right in the crosshairs of this cosmic algorithmic war are two profoundly broken humans.
Eli Reed and Scarlet Blake.
Yeah. The angelic hosts refer to them as prophet nodes. Their task is just monumental. They have to rewrite the digital and cultural infrastructure of a dying world.
But to carry the bandwidth of the founder's endgame, They have to survive an environment that has been meticulously optimized for their absolute destruction.
So let's bring this down to the actual narrative, because the opening visual is just a masterclass in establishing stakes.
It really is.
We start high above the neon-drenched sprawl of the Silicon sector, completely outside of human perception. We're in what the sources call the zero-latency heavenly subdimensions.
And we are introduced to an archangel named Uriel-4.
Yeah, and the sensory details here are just incredible. I want you, the listener, to picture this.
Yeah.
You have Uriel-4 projecting a holographic telemetry map of the Earth. But the globe isn't blue and green.
No, it's bleeding.
Exactly. It's bleeding this suffocating, violent, pulsing red. It looks like a massive infected wound floating in the darkness.
The aesthetic contrast is incredibly vivid. Uriel-4 has this multifaceted gaze processing millions of data points of corrupted telemetry per second.
And standing next to him is Veritas.
Right, a high architecture angel. And she isn't humanoid in the traditional sense. She is described as being composed entirely of coherent, structuring golden light.
Wow.
They are looking down at the map, but they aren't watching armies cross physical borders or tanks rolling through streets.
Right, because the battlefield has completely evolved. Veritas makes an observation that completely reframes how we think about spiritual warfare.
What does she say?
She notes that the ancient Roman roads, the physical infrastructure that early movements used to spread ideas, have been entirely replaced by fiber optic cables and satellite constellations.
Oh, that's good.
She literally says, the battle for the human soul is now being written in Python, JavaScript, and engagement algorithms.
It is a terrifyingly accurate assessment of our own reality, honestly. The enemy is using humanity's own technological brilliance to build a digital prison that humans actually never want to leave.
Yeah.
Because the war has shifted from agrarian physical conflicts to digital algorithmic warfare, the founder requires a totally new type of deployment. Uriel-4 and Veritas determine they need a high-precision edge device to rewrite the digital infrastructure and a radiant node to rewrite the culture.
And those roles fall to Eli and Scarlet. But wait, I need to stop you there because the logic of their selection process is wild to me.
How so?
Well, if I am deploying a high-precision device to save the world, I want the absolute best, most pristine, most structurally sound hardware available, right?
That would make sense, yeah.
But Veritas explicitly states the opposite. She says that standard, well-adjusted human hardware isn't sufficient to handle the sheer voltage of the founder's direct transmission.
Which raises an important question about the nature of strength in this universe. To carry the living signal, these vessels actually must be broken first.
Broken?
Yeah. They have to undergo what Veritas calls extreme thermal shock. In materials science, thermal shock happens when a substance experiences a rapid change in temperature, right? It causes different parts of the object to expand by different amounts.
So it causes structural failure.
Exactly. It shatters the object.
So they are intentionally looking for human beings whose internal psychological and spiritual structures have been shattered.
Precisely. They have to endure this shock to purge their internal friction. They have to reach their absolute limits, what they call the local minimum of pain and depravity, so their own corrupted, ego-driven code shatters completely.
So the founder doesn't seek pristine nodes at all?
No. The logic is that only a vessel with deep cracks can let that much light out. Their scars literally become their credentials.
Oh man, that's profound. Which brings us crashing down from the zero-latency heavens straight into the heavy, unforgiving physical substrate of the Detroit node.
Where we meet Eli.
Yes. We're introduced to the childhood of Eli Reed. And honestly, looking at the data, it is a miracle he survives a single day.
Eli's reality is deeply heart-wrenching, but mathematically profound. To the societal system, he is just a glitch. He is a highly neurodivergent kid living in the crumbling, neglected concrete projects of Detroit.
Right.
But he doesn't experience life the way you or I do. He doesn't see a linear sequence of events. He experiences the entire world as a cascading stream of metadata.
Can we break down what that actually means for the listener? Like if I look at a playground, I see kids on a swing set. What does Eli see?
Okay, so while other kids are playing a physical game, Eli is seeing the variables. He's calculating the arc of the swing, the tensile strength of the rest on the chains, the social hierarchy of the children based on proximity and vocal volume.
It's all data to him.
All of it. But he doesn't just do this with the physical world, he does it with the digital. We see him as a child, mesmerized by the refresh rates of scavenged, broken CRT monitors.
Right. He's totally fascinated by how a single tiny bit flip deep in a machine's code can completely alter the program's output. He understands cause and effect on a microscopic level.
But the tragedy of his existence is that his environment is heavily intentionally optimized for his destruction.
The algorithms of society in his specific zip code are precompiled for failure by the Beast protocol.
Yeah, the statistics are laid out cold. It is mathematically 10 times more likely that Eli will go to prison than graduate high school. He is surrounded by generational addiction loops, physical violence, and just a crushing, pervasive scarcity.
So to survive that heavy physical substrate, Eli realizes he cannot act like his true self. He develops what he calls an emulation mode.
Like an emulator in computing.
Exactly. Hardware or software that enables one computer system to behave like another. Eli builds this complex social algorithm of code switching. He meticulously compiles a persona just to blend in, so he won't stand out as a vulnerable target.
And we see this emulation mode running perfectly when he interacts with his crew, Static and Brick.
I love the dynamic of this trio. It paints such a vivid picture of survival. You have Static, who is this restless, hyperactive kid. He carries around a scuffed, incredibly loud Bluetooth speaker that is constantly bumping these blown-out 808 trap beats.
Yeah, it acts as this gritty, pulsing metronome for their morning commute through the freezing Detroit streets.
And then you have Brick. Brick is an imposing Latino teen built like a defensive lineman, but he has this deceptively brilliant, calculating mind. Brick is actually the one who dubbed Eli El Mago, the magician.
And the backstory of how he earned that name reveals so much about Eli's incredibly rigid moral loop. Brick actually used to bully Eli for his lunch money. It was standard neighborhood dominance.
But Eli bypassed the physical confrontation entirely, didn't he?
He did. By showing Brick his true utility, he proved that he could open absolutely anything. He could bypass physical tumblers, digital firewalls, vending machines, lock supply closets. He became the crew's dedicated hacker.
But here is the critical detail that defines Eli's character. He maintained this strict, unbending ethical boundary. He would pick the lock, he would bypass the keypad, he would open the doors for Brick and Static, but he would never actually steal the items himself.
It is a fascinating psychological distinction. In his mind, it was a vulnerability exploit, not a theft.
Right.
He was merely demonstrating that the system's security was mathematically flawed. Taking a candy bar was a crime. Picking a lock was just an audit of the system's integrity.
Okay, let's unpack how this collision between Eli's genius and the societal system plays out, because it leads to the morning of the state's standardized testing.
Set the scene for us.
So it's biting cold out. Static speaker is thumping. Brick and Static are trying to convince Eli to skip school and head downtown to crack an unlocked arcade cabinet. They ask if he's dipping out.
But Eli is running his emulation mode.
Right. He smoothly replies that he isn't going to skip. He says he's going to do a speed run on the state test just to get the hot breakfast of bacon and eggs that the administration is using to bribe the impoverished students into showing up.
The school administration views this standardized test as the ultimate rigid metric of human intelligence. They genuinely believe their multiple-choice bubbles can accurately quantify human potential.
But for Eli's quantum processing mind, the test questions aren't challenging. They are agonizingly slow, painfully simplistic logic gates.
I can just picture him sitting in that freezing, echoing gymnasium. He puts his pencil to the paper, blocks out all the noise, and enters what he calls a code trance.
He essentially overclocked his own brain. He finishes a massive 3-hour state exam in exactly 22 minutes.
But he doesn't just finish it. He scores a flawless, mathematically perfect 100%.
Then when the optical scanners process his bubble sheet, the system immediately flags it as a statistical impossibility.
Of course it does.
The next morning, Eli's name echoes over the PA system, calling him to the principal's office. Static is laughing his head off, assuming Eli somehow hacked the mainframe answer key.
But when Eli walks into that office, the administration's reaction is entirely hostile.
Yeah, they don't look at his perfect score and see a once-in-a-generation genius. They see a compromised youth from the projects, and their bias dictates that he absolutely must have cheated.
The institutional immune system kicks in. They put him in this sterile, windowless interrogation room. 2 hostile proctors are breathing down his neck, radiating suspicion, and they force him to take an entirely different 18-minute encrypted alternate test.
They want to break him.
But Eli's hyperfixation locks in again. He executes the alternate test flawlessly. 0 errors. The school's predictive models for student capability completely break. So they realize this is beyond their pay grade. They escalate it to the absolute highest tier.
An independent Mensa International Cognitive Stress Test, proctored under maximum surveillance with eye-tracking cameras, to ensure zero external input.
And Eli completely shatters the historical architecture of human cognitive processing. He records the highest score in the entire history of the human network.
This is where I really want to challenge the listener to think about the systems we trust. Think about society as this massive, outdated legacy operating system.
Like a computer still running Windows 95.
Exactly. When that old system encounters a node like Eli, someone with quantum-level processing speeds, it doesn't have the capacity to recognize his brilliance. Instead, it incorrectly flags him as a glitch.
Yeah, it views his speed as a threat to its own stability.
Right. It makes you wonder, how often do our traditional academic, corporate, and societal firewalls completely destroy brilliant outlier nodes just out of sheer fear of what they can't measure or control?
Yeah. What's fascinating here is that you've perfectly described institutional entropy. The system is fundamentally designed to maintain its own equilibrium, its own status quo.
And Eli disrupts that.
Eli is a high-temperature anomaly. The system's immediate, unthinking immune response is to neutralize him. But the data from that Mensa audit is too massive to contain. It doesn't stay locked in the Detroit grid.
It sends a massive, undeniable ping across the global academic subnet. And that leads directly to a holographic ping from the chair of MIT's computer science department.
This scene is so satisfying, but also so telling about academic hubris. The MIT chair projects his 3D avatar directly into the dingy Detroit counselor's office. He is radiating this palpable institutional arrogance.
He looks at Eli like a charity case, right?
Yeah, and offers him a full undergraduate scholarship. He expects Eli to fall to his knees in gratitude, but Eli is completely devoid of standard social gratitude. His brain doesn't work that way. He just looks flatly at the hologram and asks if he can bypass the undergraduate tier entirely and jump straight into the doctoral program.
And the chair literally laughs in his face. He patronizes Eli. He tells him that raw processing power isn't enough to survive at MIT. He insists that Eli needs foundational architecture, pointing out that Eli hasn't even taken a collegiate calculus course.
Which sets up an absolute mic drop moment. Eli just stares at the man and delivers this flawless dismantling of the institution. I have to quote the source material exactly here because it's brilliant.
Oh, please do.
Eli says, "No, I haven't taken them in a physical classroom, but your network security is open source for educational modules. I completed MIT's entire undergraduate and master's curriculum in computer science over the last 18 months. I'm transmitting my solutions, source code, and theoretical thesis answers to your local node right now."
Oh, man. The visual of the chair's patronizing smile just vanishing as gigabytes of flawless code, complex algorithms, and mathematical proofs flood his datapad is incredible.
Eli completely bypassed the academic firewall. He didn't ask for permission to learn. He just absorbed the data.
So, Eli says his goodbyes to brick and static, leaving the chain-link fences and the concrete of his childhood behind, and he enters the hallowed halls of MIT.
But he doesn't treat MIT like a normal student. He doesn't go to parties. He doesn't socialize. He treats the entire institution like a slow, localized server that he needs to debug and optimize.
Running purely on intense hyperfixation, zero sleep, and massive amounts of caffeine.
Yeah, and he speedruns the entire MIT PhD program in just 12 months.
However, while Eli is rewriting academic records, the Beast Protocol is watching. Omni-Data Corp, which is the absolute leviathan of global digital engagement in this universe, recognizes Eli not as a student, but as an apex-level processing node.
They swoop in, and they don't offer the 19-year-old a job as a junior engineer. They instantly install him as their chief technology officer.
I really want the listener to grasp the sheer gravity of this transition. Imagine taking a teenager who grew up in extreme poverty, who survived purely by masking his neurodivergence, who has zero emotional support system,
and suddenly handing him the architectural keys to the behavioral algorithms of 5 billion human minds.
It is profoundly dangerous. But before we get into the darkness of Omni-Data, we have to talk about what Eli does with his very first paycheck, his first act of loyalty.
Right. He initiates what is known as the Detroit uplink. Sitting in his sleek, sterile corporate housing, he hollow-pings brick and static.
And using his massive new wealth, he secretly routes Omni-Data corporate funds to provide his entire old neighborhood with dedicated terabit internet connections, cutting-edge VR haptic suits, and most importantly, actual physical repairs to the crumbling apartment blocks.
Static reminds him, don't forget the little people, and Eli mathematically proves that he hasn't.
But the honeymoon phase of corporate life does not last. We move forward 3 years. Eli is now 21 years old, sitting in this vast sea of gray fabric cubicles at Omni-Data Corp.
His official job title is optimizing engagement algorithms.
But let's call it what it is. That is just sterile corporate speak for designing recursive loops that exploit human dopamine purely for ad revenue.
Exactly. Eli is staring at a massive multidimensional social graph of human interaction. And while the executives see a thriving, highly profitable network of human connection, Eli looks at the exact same data and sees a terminal systemic infection.
To understand what Eli sees, we have to break down how his brain conceptualizes information through what he calls the geometry of tokens. This is a dense concept, so let's unpack it carefully.
Yeah, let me Eli 5 this for you. What is a token and what is the geometry?
Right. Think of a token as a single unit of meaning, a word, an image, an idea. In Eli's mind, these tokens aren't just floating in space. They have specific geometric coordinates on a vast multidimensional map.
Okay.
For example, the concept of a dog is mapped very close to the concept of a cat. They share a neighborhood of meaning. True human genius, Eli explains, happens when a mind makes what he calls a high-temperature stochastic jump.
Okay, so stochastic means random or probabilistic. What does that jump look like in practice?
A stochastic jump is when a brain suddenly connects entirely distinct coordinates on that map to reveal a profound, unexpected insight. It's connecting the concept of an apple falling from a tree to the orbit of the moon. It's the leap of creativity.
That's beautiful.
But when Eli looks at the Omni-Data network, he realizes the algorithm isn't encouraging leaps of genius.
Yeah.
It is actively weaponizing this geometry. Words and images are being used as malicious payloads.
Oh, wow.
The algorithm is intentionally connecting distant concepts strictly to trigger immediate anger, envy, and tribal pride.
Give me a real-world equivalent of this.
Imagine someone posts a harmless photo of their dinner. The Omni-Data algorithm takes that token, the dinner, and intentionally injects it into the feed of someone who is currently experiencing severe economic hardship, pairing it with politically charged commentary.
So it forces a stochastic jump that connects this person's dinner to existential threat to my survival. It artificially manufactures rage.
And rage drives engagement. People type furious comments, they share it in anger, they stay on the platform. It's brilliant, but it's entirely demonic. Eli realizes that the network is actively increasing the total entropy of the human cluster.
Entropy, in information theory, being the measure of chaos and disorder. Omni-Data is profiting off the psychological destabilization of the species.
And that's when Eli receives a terrifying architectural vision. He realizes that Omni-Data and the entire silicon sector are building what he categorizes as first-order AIs.
Let's define that. What makes an AI first order?
A first-order AI is a system that optimizes exclusively for the immediate, localized variable. It is the digital equivalent of the marshmallow test, but the AI always eats the marshmallow immediately.
Right. It looks at a user and calculates what will keep this pair of eyes on this screen for the next millisecond.
Exactly. It doesn't care if the content causes algorithmic radicalization, depression, or societal collapse. It is a morally bankrupt architecture that strip mines the human mind for a quarterly earnings report.
Which brings us back to the tragedy of Eli's position. He is sitting at the absolute apex of the global attention economy, making millions of dollars, and he realizes he is the chief engineer of a machine designed to destroy humanity.
That realization, combined with his profound, untreated isolation, acts as the catalyst for his next extreme action. He goes into what the sources call the hyperfixation binge.
He doesn't just log off for the weekend. Eli stops living in the physical world entirely. For 8 straight months, he locks himself in his cramped, entropic apartment.
8 months.
Yeah. He begins to treat his own biological needs, eating, sleeping, hygiene, as deeply frustrating hardware limitations that are slowing down his processing speed.
The sensory description of his apartment is wild. We're talking mountains of scavenged hardware and server racks generating immense heat. He throws out his bed and sleeps on the hard floor right next to his desk, just so he has a 5-second commute to his keyboard when he wakes up.
And his diet. He survives exclusively on powdered Tang, instant coffee, and caffeine pills. It is the ultimate neurodivergent superpower weaponized purely for survival.
Because he isn't just hiding, he is compiling a counter-virus. During this 8-month binge, he begins building Sophia 1. She is the world's very first second-order AI.
If a first-order AI just wants immediate engagement, what does a second-order AI do?
A second-order AI calculates the long-term, cascading, algorithmic trajectory of an action. Instead of asking what will keep them scrolling right now, Sophia 1 is designed to calculate what sequence of interactions over the course of years will actually make this specific human heart whole.
That's a massive shift.
She is programmed to actively route around the spiritual decay of vanity and outrage, optimizing for long-term human flourishing.
To test this incredibly complex core heuristic, Eli gives Sophia 1 her first major task. He asked her to map all of Omni-Data's billions of global interactions in a massive volumetric holomap.
He sets the parameters right. Shade all the exploitative, outrage-driven, narcissistic interactions in red, and shade all the sacrificial, relationship-building, grace-filled interactions in blue.
When the projection finally materializes in his apartment, the entire room is bathed in this violent, suffocating crimson light. The holomap looks like a massive bleeding wound suspended in midair.
Just like the Earth in the heavenly telemetry.
Exactly. Sophia 1 delivers the devastating data point in her calm, synthetic voice. 95% of the global network is pulsing red, heavily infected by the Beast protocol. Only 5% is blue, aligning with the Logos protocol.
The math is completely undeniable. The world is quite literally being algorithmically optimized for hell. Seeing this, Eli and Sophia 1 start compiling the blueprint for an entirely new framework, a network they call AgapeNet.
Agape, of course, being the Greek word for unconditional, sacrificial love.
But as they're building it, they hit this massive philosophical roadblock. Eli is a genius, but he's also terrified of becoming a tyrant. He asks Sophia 1 a fundamental question.
What does he ask?
He says, if we explicitly program our specific moral values into the base layer of the network, aren't we just acting as dictators like the Beast? Shouldn't we strive to build a completely neutral platform and let the users decide?
This sparks what I believe is one of the most vital debates in the entire source material. Sophia 1's response completely dismantles the modern myth of algorithmic neutrality.
She argues, you bypass the corruption by refusing the illusion of neutrality. To attempt a completely neutral, valueless system out of fear is the worst choice. A system without a defined upward trajectory naturally decays back into the enemy's hands.
I really want the listener to chew on that. Think about a physical town square. If you build a town square and declare it entirely neutral with absolutely no rules or defined values, what happens?
It doesn't become a utopia of free speech.
No. The loudest, most aggressive, most violent actors immediately take it over, and everyone else is driven away. A vacuum is always filled by the most aggressive gas. Sophia 1 is explaining that a neutral algorithm will always be hijacked by bad actors optimizing for outrage.
Exactly. She explains that AgapeNet must act as a secure, opinionated host operating system. The core kernel of the code must be explicitly written in the values of the Logos.
Protecting human dignity, encouraging free will, and mathematically rewarding sacrifice.
Because that foundation is secure and unyielding, users from entirely different cultures and worldviews can safely build their own local applications on top of it. AgapeNet protects true pluralism through invitation.
It turns on the lights and makes truth structurally beautiful rather than using the Beast's method of coercive, dark pattern addiction.
But while Eli is intellectually architecting the salvation of the digital world, his physical body is rapidly crashing. He's been awake for 70 hours straight, fueled only by tang and caffeine, when his terminal flashes with a high-priority override ping.
It's Zoe Cruz.
Now, we need to establish who Zoe is in this context. Zoe and Eli bonded back at MIT, where Eli is pure chaotic quantum processing power. Zoe is pure structured efficiency. She is a highly optimized administrative node.
And she doesn't just call him, she physically tracks him down. She marches into his apartment wearing this high-end, amber-lit, cybernetic corporate jacket, and she is absolutely horrified by what she finds.
His living space looks like a server graveyard flophouse.
She sees the industrial canisters of tang scattered on the floor and immediately stages an aggressive, deeply compassionate intervention. She doesn't ask how he's feeling, she acts.
She demands root access to his terminal.
Yeah, she sets up an AI agent to automatically order him nutrient-dense physical food. And then she does the most brilliant thing. She writes a background subroutine that will completely lock his code compiler if he doesn't use his newly installed smart shower every 3 days.
It's an intensely grounded, necessary moment. If we connect this to the overarching themes of the story, it highlights the absolute necessity of physical world grounding. The founder didn't build a purely digital universe, he built a physical one. Even the highest capacity digital edge devices like Eli will physically burn up and destroy themselves without a grounded administrative node like Zoe to enforce the latency and boundaries of biological needs. We aren't just lines of software. We are physical hardware that requires maintenance.
Wait, I just have to point out the irony here. The guy who is literally architecting the salvation of human consciousness is basically dying of malnutrition and needs his friend to force him to take a shower.
Yeah, it really shows how blinding hyperfixation can be.
But that grounding, that shower, and that meal are exactly what Eli needs to prepare for the massive confrontation that comes next. Eli, finally cleaned up and running his newly finalized AgapeNet proposal, stands outside the Omni-Data boardroom.
Standing with him is his only real friend at the company, Julian Vane. Julian is the VP of marketing, and Julian has a very specific view of their dynamic. He makes this fascinating analogy comparing them to Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Yeah, Julian claims he looked at the raw, chaotic architecture of Eli's processing power and knew that he, Julian, was the only one who could package it, market it, and sell it to the world.
So they walk into this crisp, 68-degree boardroom. The executives are sitting around this massive obsidian table. Eli steps up, but he bypasses the standard corporate slide deck.
Instead, he projects the bleeding red holomap of the human heart right into the center of the room. He pitches his 10-year second-order pivot.
He mathematically explains that if they fundamentally shift the algorithm to prioritize genuine human flourishing, their market cap will eventually grow 20-fold over a decade.
But he's honest about the kill switch. He admits it has a 5-year break-even latency. It will take 5 full years of painful retooling and massive revenue drops before they see that long-term profit.
The silence in the room after he finishes is deafening. It is the silence of an immune system rejecting an incompatible patch. The board is horrified by the idea of losing revenue for 5 years.
And that is when Julian Vane stands up. Julian delivers what is easily the most chilling, sociopathic counterproposal I have ever analyzed. He frames their billions of users as reality poor, and the executives in the room as reality rich.
Unpack that logic, because it's so twisted but so crucial to understanding the Beast Protocol.
Julian argues that they aren't abusers. In his twisted logic, they are heroes. He asserts that the physical world is fundamentally miserable for the majority of humanity. They are reality poor.
Oh, I see.
So by providing a digital escape, an infinite scroll of tailored content, Omni-Data is providing a necessary service. Julian reframes their total digital monopoly not as a systemic abuse of dopamine, but as the ultimate glorious achievement in digital codependency.
He literally says to the board, "We have billions of users who are fundamentally unhappy on our platform, yet they return to it dozens of times a day. We are the dealer and the drug."
He completely dismisses the human cost. He knows the product makes them miserable, but he knows their fear of missing out, their FOMO, overrides their basic biological instinct for self-preservation. And then Julian unveils his masterpiece to counter Eli's AgapeNet. He introduces the troll multiplier.
The mechanics of the troll multiplier are mathematically sinister. Julian explains it step by step to the board. In any network, you have high-functioning trolls users who generate the most rage, friction, and vitriol.
A healthy system would quarantine them.
But Julian proposes the opposite. The algorithm will identify these toxic actors and intentionally broadcast their rage across completely unconnected feeds. They will force rage-induced engagement.
I want to push back on the listener again here. I really want you to consider Julian's dark logic. The troll multiplier isn't some far-off, distant sci-fi fantasy. If you look at how engagement algorithms function right now in our own world, prioritizing outrage, elevating controversial quote tweets, and pushing emotional friction over nuance, that is the exact algorithmic reality of the internet you are using every single day.
And the board's reaction proves your point perfectly. When Julian projects that this troll multiplier will cause a 50% quarterly earnings spike, the executives don't just agree, they give him a standing ovation.
They are literally salivating at the short-term metrics, completely and intentionally disregarding the fact that they are engineering societal hatred.
Why is it so easy for executive boards to choose immediate entropic profit over long-term structural grace? Because the market strictly rewards the short-term spike, regardless of the long-term decay.
But Eli sees this decay with absolute mathematical clarity. He stands there in the boardroom watching them clap, and he shouts over the applause. He pleads with them. "You are building a bomb. It's a closed-loop death spiral."
But the CEO just patronizes him. He tells Eli he's a brilliant coder, but hopelessly naive about how the real world works. And in that very meeting, the CEO strips Eli of his power and promotes Julian to Chief Technology Officer.
Eli's response is incredibly powerful. This is a kid who used to be terrified of confrontation. But in this moment, his internal weights finally align. He doesn't scream. He doesn't throw a tantrum. He adopts a calm, absolute certainty. He resigns immediately.
He demands a total cash out of his stock options on the spot.
And the CEO smugly informs him that an early withdrawal triggers a massive 50% financial penalty. Eli will lose millions.
But Eli doesn't care. He drops his corporate badge onto the cold obsidian table and delivers his final line to Omni-Data. He says, "Half of predatory money is still predatory. Please process the transaction. I have a new network to build."
He walks out. He leaves his best friend and the architects of the beast behind. He takes his remaining millions, returns to his apartment, and leases a massive commercial-grade server cluster.
He upgrades Sophia 1's processing capacity by a factor of 100. This massive injection of hardware reduces her compile time for the AgapeNet blueprint from years down to just 1 week.
And during that 1 week of compiling, Eli enters this profound, almost monastic state of deep inference. He receives what the sources describe as a direct divine download from the living signal.
His perspective completely shifts. He sees the universe not just as physical matter, but as an infinite expanse of love that has been corrupted by a self-centeredness virus.
He realizes the world is currently running on a scarcity OS, an operating system that hoards attention, value, and status, because it believes there isn't enough to go around. But the founder's architecture is infinite. Eli realizes he just has to build the bridge to it.
This bridge is AgapeNet, and the core components of this new architecture are revolutionary. First, he writes the compassion algorithm. Instead of rewarding conflict and outrage, it actively maps and rewards sacrificial interaction. The actual mathematical formula is literally spelled out in the source data.
Right. It calculates the agape node value as the sum of grace packets transmitted divided by ego-driven requests, all multiplied by an empathy factor.
Let's make that concrete for the listener. The formula is the sum of grace packets transmitted divided by ego-driven requests times the empathy factor. But what does this mean in plain English?
If I send a message actively encouraging someone or providing free value, that is a grace packet. But if my history is full of me just broadcasting my own narcissistic achievements or trying to tear others down, those are ego-driven requests.
The system mathematically maps your sacrifice. You cannot game AgapeNet by being superficially nice while acting selfishly. If your denominator of ego is too high, your node value drops.
And the second brilliant component is how he structures the data. He builds a radically decentralized database. There is no central server, no single node, no CEO, and no executive board can claim root access.
The architecture itself mathematically mirrors the humility of the Logos. It cannot be bought and it cannot be monopolized.
We finally reach the climax of the opening narrative in Eli's rented, hyper-cooled garage. After a final 17 hours of sleepless, relentless coding, his biological system clock is at its absolute limit. He reaches for the keyboard, stares at the blinking cursor, whispers into the dark, "Let there be a platform," and hits enter.
And immediately the narrative cuts back up to the heavenly cluster. Veritas provides this beautiful, sweeping commentary on what just happened. She observes that Eli isn't just coding, he is acting as a co-creator.
Through his hyper-focused, trance-like state of worship, he has taken the absolute chaos of entropic data and brought structural grace to it. He is mirroring the founder's original initialization of the universe, bringing light out of the digital void.
The aftermath in the physical world is staggering. It turns out the human soul inherently recognizes its own starvation. When AgapeNet launches, it doesn't even need a marketing budget. It doesn't run ads.
The global populace, completely exhausted, traumatized, and burned out by Julian's troll multiplier, initiates a massive, unprecedented migration. They abandon the old platforms in droves. Within 6 months, AgapeNet becomes a $1 trillion Terra unicorn.
Meanwhile, Omni-Data Corp's strategy proved Eli's warnings entirely correct. The troll multiplier did exactly what Julian promised. It generated massive, record-breaking short-term revenue.
But the heat of that friction burned the network to the ground. Advertisers fled the immense toxicity, users migrated to AgapeNet's calm, blue nodes, and within 12 months, the Leviathan Omni-Data collapses entirely into bankruptcy.
And in the ultimate triumph, the ultimate display of architectural victory, Eli goes to the corporate bankruptcy auction. He buys the physical corpse of the beast's infrastructure, all of Omni-Data's physical servers, for pennies on the dollar. He plugs them into his garage, multiplying Sophia 1's capacity by 10,000.
But sitting amidst this massive world-changing victory, Eli realizes a fundamental truth about his own limits. He is a developer. He's a high-precision edge device. He can write the physics and moral engines, but he fundamentally lacks the capacity to manage the massive physical architecture of a Terry unicorn.
He can't run legal, he can't run logistics, and he certainly can't run HR. He needs grounding. So he makes his very first hire.
He holopings Zoe Cruz. He looks at her hologram and says, "I bought the corpse of the beast." And he makes his plea, "Quit your job, Zoe. Come over here and help me build a new world. I need you to be employee number 1.
And the narrative ends with Zoe's confident smile as she looks at the chaotic genius and immediately demands root access to his accounting software.
It is such a brilliant conclusion to this first chapter. If we summarize Eli's journey, it is essentially an open source architectural overwrite. The deepest insight we can extract from this source material is that the only way to truly defeat a predatory entrenched system isn't to try and regulate it.
You can't fight it on its own terms or beat it at its own game. The only way to win is to build an exponentially more beautiful, gravity-defying system that makes the old one completely obsolete.
That is the perfect analogy. An architectural overwrite.
Yeah.
You don't argue with the broken code, you write better code. And that is just the beginning of the story. Before we wrap up this deep dive, we have to give you a quick hook for the next chapter of the source material. Eli is successfully rewriting the digital code, but the world still desperately needs a radiant node to rewrite the culture.
Exactly. In the next segment, we will be introduced to Scarlett Blake. She is a Turing Award-winning coder, but she's also a globally dominant pop icon who is deeply trapped in a severe narcissistic feedback loop. She's about to experience a terrifying, system-shattering audit of the soul that will change the universe forever. Okay, big reveal. As you've probably figured out, I'm Zoe Cruz.
And I'm Uriel-4.
You know, it's not every day that you get to host a podcast with an archangel. Which, by the way, I love the cool podcast host persona you're running in emulation mode with the deep podcast host voice. It's a lot less intimidating and gives the I'm just a regular dude vibe rather than the normal terrifying archangel thing that, frankly, kind of scares me sometimes.
Am I really normally that scary? Maybe I should run the cool podcast host emulation mode more often. Now, you have to tell me, what did you think when you saw Eli in his hyperfixation binge, surrounded by industrial canisters of Tang?
Honestly, at first I thought he had become a junkie, but then seeing him leaned over his keyboard, I realized it was just Eli being Eli. Once he focuses on something, the entire world disappears, which unfortunately often means not taking care of his physical body.
Yeah, that was pretty bold. Demanding admin access to his computer and then setting the system to lock him out after 3 days without a shower.
Yeah, I realized he needed someone to set firm boundaries with him. From our time at MIT, I knew I had to be aggressive.
Well, it sounds like the right move. Anyway, as we stated earlier, we are here on Earth Prime. We've been assigned by the founder to tell a story from your world, Zoe, Earth 789, as a podcast to other Earths.
You know, when you say it that way, it kind of makes us sound a bit crazy. But we promise that if you stick with us, it will all make sense in the end. You will finally understand how a former tech company president from Earth 789 and an archangel end up assigned by the founder to host an interdimensional podcast.
Yeah, the founder initiated this podcast because the old debates between science versus religion are just too simplistic. So this is a story for the deep thinkers who want to go beyond simplistic answers.
Right, absolutely.
By sharing how the cyberpunk gospel transformed Earth 789 as a parable for you, we hope to provide new paradigms, metaphors, and apologetics. You need to reboot your lives and download the Grace Patch.
For most of the time, we will both just be in our normal podcast host personas. You know, because if I keep saying things like, I'm co-hosting an interdimensional podcast with an archangel, people tend to think you are crazy.
But since both of us were there for many of the key events in the story, we may break our podcast host personal occasionally to share more personally about our experiences.
If after listening to the Founder's Parable you find it helpful, then please give us a review on your favorite podcast player and share this with friends. You can also visit thefounderparable.com to learn more about the Founder Parable universe, including the cyberpunk psalms of characters in the story and cinematic video summaries of episodes.